My name is Joyce, and I'm 28 years old. 20 years ago, my entire family left me behind like I was nothing more than excess baggage they couldn't afford to carry. I was 8 years old when my godmother Margaret whispered those devastating words that would haunt me for decades. Your dad signed you away. Now I'm standing at the door of their $1 million home in Malibu, holding the truth that will destroy everything they built on the foundation of my abandonment. Before we begin this journey of betrayal and ultimate triumph, let me know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe family should mean everything, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything about blood bonds versus chosen family. The spring of 2004 started like any other in our comfortable suburban home in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Our two-story colonial house sat on Maple Street, complete with the white picket fence my mother Patricia had always dreamed of. My father Thomas worked as a senior associate at a prestigious law firm in Stamford, commuting 45 minutes each way in his silver BMW. My mother stayed home managing our household and volunteering at the local elementary school where I was in second grade. Our family portrait hung prominently in the living room above the fireplace. There was Dad with his confident smile and perfectly styled brown hair, Mum with her gentle blue eyes and pearl necklace she wore every Sunday to church, me with my gap-toothed grin and pigtails, my 6-year-old brother Kevin trying to look serious but failing to hide his mischievous smirk, and little 4-year-old Sophie clutching her favourite stuffed bunny named Whiskers. Every evening at 6:30 we gathered around our oak dining table for dinner. Dad would ask about our days while Mum served her famous pot roast or homemade lasagna. Kevin would tell jokes he learned at school, making Sophie giggle until milk came out her nose. I would share what I learned in Mrs. Henderson's class, and Dad would help me with my multiplication tables over dessert. Saturday mornings meant pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse with Dad manning the griddle while wearing Mum's frilly apron, making us all laugh. Sunday afternoons we'd pile into Dad's car for drives through the countryside, stopping at farm stands for fresh apples or searching for the perfect pumpkin in October. During summer evenings, we'd catch fireflies in mason jars, and Dad would tell us stories about the stars while we lay on blankets in the backyard. I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Thursday evening in March, 3 weeks after my 8th birthday. I had gotten up for a glass of water and heard my parents arguing in hushed tones in Dad's study. The door was slightly open and yellow light spilled into the dark hallway. Dad's voice was tense as he said something about a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and 3 times the salary. Mum's response was sharp, mentioning the children and stability. Then I heard Dad say something that made my stomach feel funny, though I didn't understand why at the time. He said the Carlyle Corporation had very specific family-friendly policies that would benefit them greatly. The next morning at breakfast, Dad announced with forced excitement that he had accepted an incredible position with Carlyle Corporation in San Diego, California. Mum's smile looked painted on as she told us what an adventure it would be. Kevin immediately asked if we'd see movie stars, while Sophie wanted to know if she could swim in the ocean every day. I was excited too, already imagining palm trees and year-round sunshine like in the movies. Dad said we'd have a pool and I could take surfing lessons. Mum promised I could decorate my new room any colour I wanted, maybe even that purple I'd been begging for. The following weeks became a whirlwind of packing and preparations. Real estate agents tramped through our house while Mum sorted our belongings into boxes labelled Keep, Donate and Storage. I carefully packed my American Girl dolls, my book collection, and the jewelry box Grandma had given me before she passed away the previous year. Dad seemed different during those weeks, more distant somehow. He'd stare at me during dinner with an expression I couldn't read, then quickly look away when I caught his eye. Mum cried a lot, but always said it was just because she was overwhelmed with all the moving details. She held me extra long at bedtime, stroking my hair and telling me she loved me over and over, until I'd squirm away embarrassed by the intensity of her affection. My godmother Margaret Mom's older sister came to visit the weekend before we were supposed to leave. She lived about an hour away in Westchester County, and I'd always loved when she visited. Margaret was everything Mum wasn't bold, where Mum was quiet, adventurous, where Mum was cautious. She wore bright red lipstick and told the funniest stories about her work as a museum curator in New York City. That Saturday morning, Margaret suggested she take me for a special day out, just the two of us. We went to my favourite ice cream parlour where she let me order a triple scoop sundae for lunch, something Mum would never allow. We walked through the park and she taught me how to skip stones across the pond. She bought me 3 new books at the bookstore and a purple journal with a tiny lock and key. As we drove back to my house, Margaret kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. Her eyes looked sad, though she kept smiling. She asked if I was excited about California, and I told her all about the surfing lessons Dad promised. She said I could visit her anytime I wanted, that her door was always open. I laughed and said California was pretty far for visits, but maybe she could come see us at Christmas. When we got home, Mum was in my room sitting on my bed surrounded by boxes. Her eyes were red and puffy. She pulled me into a fierce hug and said Margaret had offered to keep me for a couple of weeks while they got the new house set up in California. It would be easier, she said, without having to worry about enrolling me in school right away or finding childcare while they unpacked. I thought it sounded fun, like an extended sleepover with my favourite aunt. Margaret had cable TV and always let me stay up late. Plus, she lived closer to my school, so I could finish out the last few weeks of second grade with my friends before joining my family in California for summer break. Moving day arrived on a grey Tuesday morning that threatened rain. The moving trucks had come the day before, swallowing up our furniture and boxes like hungry monsters. The house echoed strangely without our belongings, and our voices bounced off the empty walls. Dad loaded the last suitcases into our silver minivan while Mum made sandwiches for their road trip. They planned to drive across the country, making it an adventure, Dad said. Kevin had his portable game system and Sophie had a new colouring book and crayons. They were both bouncing with excitement about seeing the Grand Canyon and staying in hotels with pools. Margaret arrived at 10 that morning to pick me up. She helped me carry my suitcase and backpack to her blue Honda Accord. Dad gave me a quick, awkward hug, barely meeting my eyes. He pressed something into my hand, a $50 bill, and told me to be good for Aunt Margaret. His voice cracked slightly when he said he'd see me soon. Mum held me so tight I could barely breathe. She was crying openly now, not even trying to hide it. She kissed my forehead, my cheeks, the top of my head. She kept saying she loved me, that she would always love me no matter what. I started to feel scared by her intensity and pulled away confused by all the emotion over a 2-week separation. Kevin hugged me and said he'd save me some candy from all the gas stations they'd stop at along the way. Sophie wrapped her little arms around my legs and asked if I'd miss her. I told her of course I would, but I'd see her really soon. She gave me Whiskers, her stuffed bunny, to keep me company. The gesture was so sweet it made my eyes water. I stood in Margaret's driveway with her arm around my shoulders, waving as my family climbed into the minivan. Mum was in the passenger seat, her face turned away from the window. Kevin and Sophie had their faces pressed against the back window, waving frantically. Dad backed out slowly, carefully, like he was prolonging the moment. As the minivan rolled down the street, I kept waving, even though my arm was getting tired. They turned the corner by the Johnsons' house, and then they were gone. The street felt too quiet, too empty. A few drops of rain started to fall, and Margaret gently guided me inside her house. I had no idea that would be the last time I'd see my family together for 20 years. The first 2 weeks at Margaret's house felt like an adventure. She had converted her guest room into a proper space for me, with new purple bedding that matched the journal she'd bought me, and glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. She took time off work to help me settle in, and we spent our days doing art projects and baking cookies. Every evening at 7 o'clock California time, which was 10 o'clock for us, my family would call. Dad would tell me about the mountains and deserts they'd driven through. Mum would describe our new house, saying my room faced the backyard, where they were installing a pool. Kevin would list all the weird flavoured sodas he'd found at truck stops, and Sophie would tell me she missed me in her sweet 4-year-old voice that made my chest ache. During the 3rd week, the calls became less frequent. Mum explained they were busy with furniture deliveries and meeting with contractors about the pool. Dad was starting his new job and working long hours to make a good impression. The time difference made it hard, she said, and I understood. They were busy setting up our new life. By the 4th week, we only talked on Sundays. Mum's voice sounded different, more formal somehow. When I asked when I'd be flying out to join them, she said they were still getting things ready. Dad rarely got on the phone anymore, always tied up with something urgent for work. Kevin and Sophie would chat for a few minutes before Mum said they needed to go. Margaret started making subtle changes that I didn't fully notice at the time. She bought me new clothes and shoes for the warming weather. She registered me for the summer reading program at the local library. She signed me up for day camp at the community centre, saying it would be good for me to make friends in the neighbourhood. Week 6 arrived with no call on Sunday. I dialed the number Mum had given me for the new house, but it just rang and rang. Margaret said they were probably out exploring San Diego, maybe at the beach or the zoo. But something cold settled in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't name but recognised as wrong. On Monday morning of week 7, Margaret sat me down at her kitchen table. Her hands shook slightly as she poured orange juice into my favorite mug, the one with cats wearing sunglasses. She said she needed to enroll me in school for the fall. The local elementary school was excellent, she said, just as good as anything in California. I protested immediately. I was supposed to start 3rd grade in San Diego with my family. This was just temporary, I reminded her. Just until they got settled. Margaret's eyes filled with tears and she pulled me into her lap, even though I was getting too big for that sort of thing. She held me close and whispered into my hair that things had changed. My parents had decided it would be better if I stayed with her for a while longer, maybe the whole school year. They needed time to adjust to Dad's new job demands, she said. They wanted what was best for me. I fought her explanation with 8-year-old logic. If they wanted what was best for me, wouldn't that mean being with them, families stayed together? That's what families did. Margaret just held me tighter and said sometimes grown-ups had to make hard choices. My 9th birthday came in February with no call from my family. A card arrived 3 days late with a $20 bill inside and signatures from everyone, even little Sophie, who had drawn a crooked heart. The handwriting on the envelope wasn't Mum's careful script, but something rushed and unfamiliar. I cried myself to sleep that night and many nights after. Margaret would sit on the edge of my bed, rubbing my back and humming old songs her mother used to sing. She never made empty promises that everything would be okay or that my family would come back soon. She just stayed with me in the sadness. One evening in March, exactly a year after my parents had announced the move, I overheard Margaret on the phone. Her voice was sharp, angry, in a way I'd never heard before. She was saying things like, unconscionable, and how could you, and think about what this is doing to her. When she found me listening at the top of the stairs, her face went pale. She ended the call immediately and came to sit beside me. I asked if she had been talking to my mom. The silence stretched between us like a taut rubber band before she finally nodded. I begged her to let me talk to Mum, but Margaret said the call had already ended. I asked when they were coming back for me. The question hung in the air like smoke from a blown-out candle. Margaret gathered me into her arms, and I felt her tears dropping onto the top of my head. Your dad signed you away, she whispered the words barely audible. He signed papers saying I would be your guardian. They're not coming back for you, sweetheart. They chose to leave you behind. The words didn't make sense. Parents didn't sign children away like they were returning a purchase to a store. I was their daughter, their firstborn. I had their eyes, their mannerisms, their DNA flowing through my veins. You couldn't just sign that away. But even as I denied it, pieces started clicking into place. Dad's inability to look at me those last weeks. Mum's desperate tears and declarations of love, the way they'd gradually faded from daily calls to no contact at all. The birthday card that felt like an obligation rather than a celebration. I ran to my room and grabbed the phone, dialing the California number with shaking fingers. A robotic voice informed me the number had been disconnected. I tried again, certain I'd misdialed. The same mechanical message played indifferent to my desperation. Margaret found me an hour later still holding the phone, pressing redial over and over as if persistence could somehow reconnect me to the family that had severed our bond. She gently took the phone from my hands and held me while I screamed and sobbed until my throat was raw and my eyes had no tears left to shed. The next day, I wrote a letter to the San Diego address I'd memorized. I poured out every feeling, every question, every plea for them to come back for me. I told them I would be good, that I wouldn't complain about anything ever again. I promised to help with Kevin and Sophie to get straight A's to be the perfect daughter if they'd just come back. 3 weeks later, the letter returned with a yellow sticker saying no such person at this address. Margaret helped me search online for Thomas Anderson in San Diego, but the few results we found led nowhere. It was as if my family had vanished into thin air, leaving no trail for me to follow. The years between 10 and 15 blurred together in a haze of grief, anger, and desperate searching. Margaret did everything she could to fill the gaping wound my family had left. But how do you replace an entire family that chose to walk away? She became my anchor in a world that had proven itself unreliable and cruel. I threw myself into school with a vengeance, as if academic excellence could somehow prove I was worthy of being kept. My report cards were flawless straight A's across every subject. Teachers praised my dedication and maturity, never knowing it stemmed from a desperate need to be good enough to be worthy of love that wouldn't abandon me. At night, I became a detective of the digital age. I learned to navigate social media platforms, search engines, and public records with the skill of someone 3 times my age. I searched for Thomas Anderson, Patricia Anderson, Kevin Anderson, Sophie Anderson. I tried different spellings, different cities in California, different combinations. When I was 13, I had a breakthrough that shattered me all over again. On a routine search with a slightly different spelling, Anderson, instead of Anderson, I found her. Patricia Anderson of Carlsbad, California. Her Facebook profile was mostly private, but her profile picture was public, and it was definitely my mother. She looked older, but happy, smiling brightly at the camera. The cover photo behind her profile picture stopped my heart. It was a family photo on a beach, everyone in matching white shirts and khaki shorts. There was Dad looking successful and tan. Kevin, now a teenager, tall and handsome. Sophie, no longer a baby, but a pretty preteen with long blonde hair. And there was another child, a girl who looked about 7 or 8, with my mother's eyes and my father's nose. She stood where I should have been standing, holding the hand. I should have been holding, smiling the smile that should have been mine. My hands shook as I clicked to send a message. I typed and deleted a dozen versions before settling on something simple. Mom, it's Joyce. I miss you. Please write back. I hit send before I could lose my nerve and waited, refreshing the page obsessively for days. A week later, I tried to send another message, only to find I'd been blocked. Her profile was now invisible to me, as if she'd never existed at all. I created a fake account and tried again, but she must have changed her privacy settings because I could no longer find her. The discovery of my replacement sister sent me into a spiral that worried Margaret enough to find me a therapist. Dr. Brennan was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in abandonment trauma. Twice a week, I sat in her office with its soft lighting and too many throw pillows, trying to make sense of how parents could simply erase a child from their lives. She helped me understand that their choice to leave said nothing about my worth and everything about their character. She taught me coping strategies for the waves of grief that would crash over me at unexpected moments. A family at a restaurant laughing together, a father teaching his daughter to ride a bike, a mother braiding her daughter's hair at the bus stop. Margaret never missed a therapy appointment, never complained about the cost, never made me feel like a burden, even though I knew I was disrupting the independent life she'd built for herself. She sold her condo in Westchester and bought a house in Scarsdale with better schools. She turned down a promotion that would have required travel because she said I needed stability. When I turned 16, I became obsessed with finding the legal truth of what had happened. Margaret had been vague about the paperwork, and I needed concrete answers. I learned that New York State had specific laws about guardianship and that there should be court records of the transfer. One day, when Margaret was at work, I searched her home office. I felt guilty invading her privacy, but the need for answers consumed me. In a locked filing cabinet that I picked open with skills learned from YouTube videos, I found a folder labeled with my name. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. There was indeed a guardianship agreement signed by both my parents and notarized. But there was more. There was correspondence from Carlyle Corporation's Human Resources Department outlining their generous relocation package for employees with families of 4 or fewer members. The benefits were staggering. Full moving expenses, temporary housing, private school tuition for up to 2 children, a signing bonus of $500,000 for families meeting their ideal profile. There was even a note about how the company culture valued small nuclear families as being more stable and committed to long-term employment. The date on the corporation letter was 2 weeks before my parents told us about the move. They had known they would leave me behind before they'd even announced we were moving. Every moment after that had been a performance, a careful orchestration of my abandonment. I also found copies of emails between my father and someone at Carlyle Corporation discussing how to structure the family documentation to qualify for the maximum benefits. My father had actually asked if there were ways to legally adjust their family size to meet corporate preferences. The response was carefully worded, but the meaning was clear. What happened before employment was not their concern, as long as the paperwork was correct. At the bottom of the folder was something that made me physically sick. It was a copy of a will from my paternal grandfather who had died when I was 5. I remembered him vaguely, a stern man who smelled like pipe tobacco and peppermints. The will left $2 million in trust for his grandchildren to be distributed when each turned 25. But there was an addendum signed by my father as trustee, moving my portion into Kevin and Sophie's trusts due to changed family circumstances. The date was 6 months after they'd left me behind. They had not only abandoned me, but stolen my inheritance in the process. Margaret found me hours later, still sitting on her office floor, surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal. She dropped to her knees beside me, gathering the papers with shaking hands. She tried to explain, to contextualize, to somehow make it less horrible than it was. She told me she'd been trying to protect me from the worst of it. She'd hired a lawyer when it first happened, tried to fight the guardianship, tried to force my parents to take responsibility. But they'd been careful legal technically within their rights, and she'd been terrified that if she pushed too hard, they'd put me in foster care rather than let me stay with her. The truth was somehow worse than the not knowing. At least when I didn't know, I could imagine scenarios where they'd been forced, where they'd had no choice, where they were somehow victims too. But the documents made it clear. This had been calculated, planned, executed for maximum financial benefit. Something fundamental shifted in me after discovering the truth. The desperate girl who'd searched for her family's love transformed into someone harder, more focused, more determined. If they could be calculating, so could I. If they could plan for their future, I could plan for mine. I told Margaret I wanted to become a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in family law and children's rights. I wanted to understand every legal mechanism that had allowed my parents to discard me, and I wanted to make sure other children were protected from similar fates. My junior and senior years of high school became a masterclass in the strategic achievement. I didn't just want good grades, I wanted valedictorian. I didn't just want to get into college, I wanted the Ivy League. I didn't just want to succeed, I wanted to become so accomplished that my family would one day realize what they'd thrown away. I captained the debate team, turning my pain into persuasive arguments about ethics and justice. I volunteered at family courts, watching proceedings and learning how the system worked and where it failed. I interned at a local law firm, filing papers and absorbing everything I could about legal strategy. My college essays wrote themselves, the story of abandonment and resilience, of choosing to channel trauma into purpose, of wanting to be the advocate I'd needed as a child. Every admissions officer who read them cried according to my guidance counselor. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, they all wanted the girl who'd turned abandonment into ambition. I chose Yale because they offered the most comprehensive financial aid and because their law school was one of the best in the country. Margaret drove me to New Haven on move-in day, both of us crying as we set up my dorm room. She'd remortgaged her house to cover what financial aid didn't, though she tried to hide that from me. College was a revelation. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who didn't know my story, who saw me as just Joyce, not abandoned Joyce, or poor Joyce, or brave Joyce. I could reinvent myself, be someone whose past didn't define every interaction. I dated for the first time a sweet boy named Marcus from my constitutional law class. He couldn't understand why I flinched when he introduced me to his large, loving family, or why I excused myself to cry in the bathroom during his family's Thanksgiving dinner. We broke up after 6 months when I realized I couldn't let anyone that close to my damage. My grades were impeccable, my professors impressed by my insight and dedication. I specialized in courses about children's rights, family law, and ethics. I wrote my senior thesis on legal guardianship loopholes and how they could be exploited to abandon children without consequence. My advisor called it brilliant but deeply disturbing. Law school applications were next, and again, my story opened doors. Yale Law School accepted me with a full scholarship. I was going to walk the same halls as Supreme Court justices and presidents, carrying my abandonment like armor that had been forged in fire. During my second year of law school, Margaret called me with news that stopped me cold. She had been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. The woman who'd saved me, who'd given up her life to raise her sister's abandoned child, was fighting for her life. I wanted to drop out to go home and care for her the way she'd cared for me. But Margaret wouldn't hear of it. She said my success was her greatest joy, that watching me rise from the ashes of my family's betrayal was worth every sacrifice she'd made. She underwent chemotherapy and radiation with the same quiet strength she'd shown when taking in a broken 8-year-old girl. I threw myself into my studies with renewed purpose, but I drove home every weekend to be with her. We spent those Saturdays going through photo albums, and she told me stories about my mother when they were young. How Patricia had always been the prettier one, the one who got everything she wanted, while Margaret was the responsible one who cleaned up the messes. She told me my mother had called once about 5 years after they'd left. She'd been drunk and crying, saying she missed me and had made a terrible mistake. But by morning, when Margaret tried to call back, the number was blocked. My mother had chosen her comfortable life over her firstborn child once again. During my final year of law school, I was recruited by Brennan Fitzgerald and Associates, one of the most prestigious family law firms in New York. They specialized in high-profile divorces and custody battles, but also did significant pro bono work for children in the system. The starting salary was more than my father had sold me for. I graduated summa cum laude with Margaret in the front row despite being weakened from her treatments. She cried through the entire ceremony, and I could see my professors wondering who this fierce woman was, who looked at me like I'd hung the moon and stars. My first case at the firm was a pro bono custody situation where grandparents were trying to get guardianship of their grandchildren after their daughter had abandoned them for her new boyfriend. The parallels to my own story were almost too much to bear, but I fought for those children like I wished someone had fought for me. I won the case, and the senior partners took notice. Within 2 years, I was handling major cases, becoming known as the lawyer who never gave up on abandoned children. My reputation grew, and with it my bank account. I bought Margaret a condo in Manhattan closer to the best cancer treatment centers and hired private nurses to care for her. By 25, I was everything my parents had never thought I'd become. Successful, respected, financially secure. But the trust fund from my grandfather still nagged at me. $2 million that should have been mine, stolen by a father who'd already taken everything else. Margaret's cancer returned when I was 27, this time stage 4. The doctors gave her months, maybe a year if we were lucky. She faced it with the same grace she'd faced everything else, more concerned about me than herself. One evening, as I sat beside her hospital bed, she pulled out a box she'd been hiding. Inside were more documents, things she'd been saving for the right time. There was my original birth certificate, photos of my early childhood I'd never seen, and something that changed everything, documentation that my father had forged my signature on the trust fund transfer. I'd been 8 years old. There was no legal way I could have signed those documents. My father had committed fraud, federal fraud, and Margaret had the proof. She'd hired a forensic document examiner years ago, but hadn't told me, because she wanted me to build my life on my own terms, not on revenge. But she was dying, and she wanted me to have the choice. She wanted me to have the power to confront them with evidence that could destroy my father's career and potentially send him to prison. The statute of limitations hadn't run out. I could still file charges. I spent weeks after Margaret's revelation staring at those documents, running my fingers over the clumsy forgery of my childhood signature. My father, the successful lawyer, had been so careful about the abandonment, but so careless about the money. Or perhaps he'd been confident that an abandoned 8-year-old would never be in a position to challenge him. Margaret passed away on a Tuesday morning in September, just as the leaves were beginning to turn. She waited until I was holding her hand, telling her it was okay to let go, that she'd done enough, been enough, loved enough. Her last words were that I was the daughter she'd never had but always wanted, and that my strength had given her life meaning. The funeral was small but beautiful. Margaret's colleagues from the museum came, as did some of my professors and partners from my firm. They all told me how proud she'd been of me, how she'd talked about me constantly, how she'd considered me her greatest accomplishment. In her will, she left me everything, the house in Scarsdale, her retirement savings, her jewellery, and a letter to be opened after her death. In it, she wrote about the day my mother had called to tell her about the plan, how she'd begged Patricia to reconsider, offered to help financially if they needed it, even threatened to call Child Protective Services. But Patricia had said Thomas had made up his mind and the money would secure their other children's futures. She'd actually said other children as if I'd already been erased from the family unit. Margaret wrote that she'd never forgiven her sister, that their relationship had died the day they'd driven away, leaving me behind. With Margaret gone, I had no reason left to show mercy. I hired a private investigator, one of the best in the business, to find my family's current situation. What he discovered was more than I'd expected. Thomas Anderson, was a senior partner at Carlyle Corporation's legal division. The same company that had incentivized him to abandon me now employed him at a salary of $800,000 a year. He lived in a $5 million house in Malibu with an ocean view and a tennis court. Patricia ran a charity called Hearts for Homes that helped underprivileged families find housing. The irony of a woman who'd abandoned her own child helping other families stay together made me physically ill. She was considered a pillar of the community, regularly featured in society magazines for her philanthropic work. Kevin had graduated from medical school and was completing his residency at UCLA Medical Center in pediatric surgery. He was engaged to a fellow doctor, a beautiful woman named Jennifer, from a wealthy family. Their wedding was planned for the following spring at a vineyard in Napa. Sophie had become an influencer with 2 million followers on Instagram, promoting wellness and self-care. Her posts about family values and the importance of sibling bonds were particularly nauseating, given that she'd grown up with a sister she'd never been told existed. And then there was Lisa, the replacement daughter, 20 years old, studying at Stanford on a full scholarship that I had no doubt my grandfather's stolen money had helped secure. She was beautiful, accomplished, and completely unaware that she had an older sister who'd been discarded to make room for the family's perfect image. I studied their social media profiles, obsessively noting patterns and important dates. Patricia posted family photos every Sunday with captions about blessed and grateful. Thomas rarely posted, but was tagged at corporate events and charity galas. Kevin shared medical articles and occasional photos with Jennifer. Sophie documented every moment of her privileged life in curated perfection. Lisa was the most interesting. Her posts had an underlying sadness, a searching quality that reminded me of myself at that age. She wrote poetry about feeling disconnected from her family, about sensing secrets in the silence between words. One post particularly stood out where she mentioned always feeling like someone was missing from their family photos. I decided Thanksgiving would be my moment. The investigator confirmed they always gathered at the Malibu house for the holiday, the one time of year when everyone came together. Patricia would cook for days, Thomas would pretend to help while mostly drinking expensive wine, and they'd all sit around their massive dining table playing at perfect family. I prepared meticulously. I had copies of every document, the guardianship papers, the Carlyle Corporation correspondence, the forged trust fund transfer, even the returned letters I'd sent as a child. I had them professionally bound in a leather folder that looked like something from Thomas's own office. I bought a new outfit, professional but not trying too hard. A navy suit that said successful lawyer, not abandoned child. I had my hair professionally styled and my makeup done. If I was going to face them after 20 years, I would do it as someone they could never have imagined I'd become. The drive from Los Angeles International Airport to Malibu took 90 minutes in holiday traffic. I used the time to practice what I would say running through scenarios and responses. But as I pulled up to their gate, my carefully rehearsed words evaporated. The house was even more magnificent than the photos had shown. 3 stories of glass and stone, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. The driveway was full of luxury cars, including Thomas's new Tesla and Patricia's white Range Rover. Through the massive windows, I could see them all gathered in the living room, laughing at something on the television. I sat in my rental car for 10 minutes, watching the family I'd been expelled from live their perfect life. Part of me wanted to drive away to let them keep their illusion, to spare myself the pain of rejection again. But then I thought of Margaret, of her strength and sacrifice, and I knew I had to face them. I walked to the door on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The doorbell was one of those video systems, and I knew they'd see me before deciding whether to open the door. I pressed it and waited, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they'd hear it through the speaker. Patricia answered the door wearing a burgundy dress and pearl earrings. For a moment she simply stared, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and then pure shock. Her hand flew to her throat and she took a step backward. I spoke first, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Hello, Mom. It's been 20 years. I think we need to talk." She opened her mouth closed, it opened it again. No sound came out. Behind her, I heard Thomas's voice asking who was at the door. Then he appeared, wineglass in hand, and the glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. "Joyce." He said my name like a foreign word he'd forgotten how to pronounce. Kevin appeared next, taller than I'd imagined his face, a mirror of shock and something that might have been recognition. Sophie was behind him, beautiful and confused. And there was Lisa, my replacement, looking between all of us with growing alarm. I stepped inside without invitation, my heels clicking on the marble as I navigated around the broken glass. The house smelled like turkey and rosemary, like the Thanksgivings I remembered from childhood. The formal living room was to the right, and I walked in, claiming space in the home I should have grown up in. They all followed, silent and staring. I took in the family photos covering one wall, 8 years of my life, erased 20 years of their life, without me documented in silver frames. There was the beach photo from Patricia's Facebook profile, plus graduation photos, vacation photos, Christmas photos, all featuring the family of 5 that had required my exile to exist. Lisa was the first to speak. "Who are you?" Her voice was younger than her 20 years, uncertain and slightly frightened. I looked directly at her, this girl who'd lived the life stolen from me. "I'm Joyce, your older sister, the one they left behind when you were born because the company Dad worked for only provided benefits for families with 2 children. The silence that followed my words felt like a living thing, thick and suffocating. Lisa's face went pale, and she sank onto the cream-coloured sofa, her hands trembling. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Kevin stood frozen, his medical training apparently useless in the face of this particular emergency. Patricia found her voice first high and strangled. Joyce, you don't understand. It wasn't like that. We didn't have a choice. I laughed, and the sound was bitter enough to make them all flinch. You didn't have a choice. You chose $500,000 and a house with an ocean view. You chose to abandon your 8-year-old daughter because she didn't fit the corporate family profile. Thomas stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in despite his shock. You need to leave. This is private property and you're trespassing. I'll call the police if necessary. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. Go ahead. Call them. I'm sure they'd be very interested in the fraudulent documents you filed to steal my inheritance from grandfather's estate. $2 million that you forged an 8-year-old's signature to obtain. That's federal fraud, Dad. Or should I call you Thomas, since you clearly stopped being my father 20 years ago? His face went from red to white in seconds. Kevin looked between Thomas and me, confusion clear on his face. What is she talking about? What inheritance? What fraud? Patricia was crying now, mascara running in dark streams down her carefully made-up face. Kevin, Sophie, please let us handle this. This is complicated and you don't understand. Sophie's voice was sharp when she spoke. We don't understand because you've been lying to us our entire lives. I had a sister. We had a sister, and you just left her behind. Lisa hadn't moved from the sofa staring at me like I was a ghost, which in a way I was. The ghost of the family they'd pretended never existed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. They left you behind when I was born. No, I said gently, recognizing she was as much a victim as I'd been. They left me 2 months after you were born. The company Dad worked for offered massive bonuses for small families. I was the 3rd child, one too many for their benefits package. So they signed guardianship over to my aunt and took you 3 to California to live their perfect life. Kevin sat down hard in one of the leather armchairs. That's why there are no pictures of you, no baby books, no drawings, nothing. Mum said there was a flood in our old house that destroyed everything from before California. Thomas tried again, his voice attempting authority, but achieving only desperation. You don't know the whole story. The company had strict policies. We would have lost everything. The opportunity, the healthcare, the education fund for the children. For the children, I repeated. But not for all your children. Just the ones that counted. The ones that fit the profile. Tell me when you were signing those papers. Did you think about me at all when you were cashing that bonus check? Did you wonder if I was okay? Patricia sobbed harder. I thought about you every day, every single day, Joyce. We were going to come back for you. Once Thomas was established, once we had savings, we were going to bring you to California. I pulled out the leather folder and set it on the coffee table. Then why did you change your phone number? Why did you return my letters unopened? Why did you block me on Facebook when I found you 5 years ago? Why did you steal my inheritance and give it to them? I opened the folder and spread out the documents. The guardianship papers, the Carlyle Corporation benefits, documentation, the emails between Thomas and the company, the forged trust documents, evidence of 20 years of calculated abandonment and theft. Sophie picked up the email exchange, reading with growing horror. Dad actually asked how to restructure the family. He planned this before telling us we were moving. Kevin was examining the trust documents with his trained eye for detail. This is your signature, he asked Thomas. You took $2 million meant for Joyce and redistributed it to us. Lisa stood, suddenly walked to the wall of family photos and started pulling them down one after another until they lay in a pile at her feet. All these years, she said, her voice stronger now. All these years of feeling like something was missing, like our family had a hole in it. It was you. You were what was missing. She turned to face Thomas and Patricia. How could you just erase a child? Your own daughter, and then raise us in this house built on her abandonment? Thomas tried one more time, his legal training making him reach for technicalities. The statute of limitations has passed for the guardianship. You can't challenge that now. And as for the trust, I was the trustee. I had discretionary power. I smiled then, and it must have been particularly unsettling because he took a step back. Actually, the statute of limitations for fraud upon discovery is 6 years in California. I discovered the fraud 18 months ago. I have the forensic document analysis proving you forged my signature. I have the original documents with my actual childhood signature for comparison. I have everything I need to not only sue you, but to have you criminally prosecuted. What do you want? Patricia asked through her tears. Money? Is that what this is about? I felt the rage that had been simmering for 20 years threaten to boil over. What do I want? I wanted my family. I wanted to grow up with my siblings. I wanted birthday parties and Christmas mornings and someone to teach me to drive. I wanted to not spend 20 years wondering what was so wrong with me that my own parents could throw me away. But what do I want now? I want justice. I want the world to know what kind of people you really are. I want your colleagues at your charity, Patricia, to know that you abandoned your own child while pretending to help others. I want the medical board to know that Kevin's education was paid for with stolen money. I want Sophie's followers to know her family values content is built on lies. Lisa spoke again. And what about me? I'm the reason this happened. They left you because of me. I walked over to her, this young woman who looked so much like I had at her age. No, you were a baby. You didn't choose any of this. They did. They chose money and comfort over their own child. That's on them, not you. Thomas's phone rang and he looked at it reflexively. The caller ID showed Carlyle Corporation. Even now, even in this moment, the company came first. He declined the call, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen his priorities hadn't changed. I have a proposal, I said, my voice now carrying the authority I'd learned in countless courtrooms. Option 1, I file both civil and criminal charges. The media will have a field day with this story. Successful lawyer abandons daughter for corporate benefits, steals her inheritance. Your careers, your reputation, everything you built on the foundation of my abandonment will crumble. Or Thomas asked, already calculating like the lawyer he was. Or you sign over everything that was mine. The $2 million plus 20 years of interest. You establish a trust fund for children abandoned by their families, administered by me. You publicly acknowledge what you did not to humiliate you, but to prevent other families from making the same choice. And you tell the truth to everyone who asks why your eldest daughter wasn't in those family photos. Kevin stood up and walked over to me. I remember you, he said suddenly. You taught me to tie my shoes. You read me stories. You let me sleep in your bed when I had nightmares. I remembered having a sister, but they told me I was confused, that I was thinking of Sophie. Sophie joined him. I have a memory of someone singing to me. A girl's voice, not Mum's. Was that you? I nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears. You loved Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I must have sung it 100 times the night before they took you away. Lisa came last, standing with her siblings, my siblings. We want to know you, she said. We want our sister back. Patricia looked at her children, united against their parents for the first time in their lives. We did it for you, she said desperately. For your futures, your education, your opportunities. Sophie's response was ice cold. No, you did it for yourselves, for the money, the lifestyle, the image. You had 3 children who loved you, and you threw one away because she was inconvenient. That's not love. That's not family. That's business. The confrontation stretched into the night as the abandoned Thanksgiving dinner grew cold in the kitchen. We sat in that perfect living room with its ocean view and designer furniture, unraveling 20 years of lies and justifications. Thomas tried every legal maneuver he knew, but I'd spent 2 years preparing for each one. He offered me money starting at $1 million and eventually reaching $5 million if I'd sign a non-disclosure agreement. The number told me everything about how much he had to lose if this became public. Patricia cycled through emotions like she was trying to find the one that would make this go away. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, but never quite reaching acceptance. She kept saying she'd wanted to keep me, that it had been Thomas's decision, that she'd been powerless against his determination. But Lisa pulled up an old email she'd found on the family computer years ago and never understood until now. It was from Patricia to a friend, dated 3 months after they'd left me, talking about how much easier life was with just 2 children and how the baby Lisa was so much less work than Joyce had been at that age. The betrayal in my siblings' eyes as they read their mother's words was almost harder to witness than my own abandonment. They were discovering their parents were strangers, capable of cruelty they'd never imagined. Kevin Ever, the doctor, tried to find a diagnosis that would explain our parents' behavior. Was it postpartum depression? Financial anxiety? Some kind of psychological break? But sometimes I told him, people just choose themselves over their children. There's no medical term for selfishness. Sophie was documenting everything on her phone, not to post but to process. She said she needed evidence this was real, that their entire family history hadn't been what she thought. She showed me videos from family vacations, birthday parties, graduations, and asked if I could see the hole where I should have been. I could, in every single one. Lisa was the one who finally asked the question none of them had voiced. What was it like growing up knowing your family didn't want you? I told them about the years of therapy, the nights crying myself to sleep, the way I still flinched when I saw families of 5 in public. I told them about Margaret, the only real mother I'd ever known, how she'd saved my life in every way a person could be saved. I told them about building myself from scratch, about choosing to become someone who protected abandoned children, because no one had protected me. Thomas's phone rang again. Carlyle Corporation for the 4th time. This time he answered it, stepping into his study. We could hear his voice, professional and smooth, discussing some emergency with a merger. Even facing the destruction of his family, both past and present work came first. When he returned, something had shifted in his face. That was the senior board, he said. Someone sent them an anonymous tip about my history with the company, about the family restructuring to qualify for benefits. They're opening an investigation. My career there is over. I hadn't sent the tip, but I wasn't surprised. Corporate whistleblowing had become common, and someone at Carlyle must have always suspected the truth about our family's convenient downsizing. Patricia looked at him with something approaching hatred. Your career, that's what you're worried about. We just lost our children's respect, possibly our children themselves, and you're worried about your career. Kevin laughed, but it was hollow. They're perfect for each other, he said to no one in particular. Both more concerned about image than family. No wonder they could leave Joyce behind. She was bad for their brand. The argument that erupted between Thomas and Patricia was 20 years in the making. She accused him of forcing her to choose. He accused her of being complicit. They threw words like weapons, each revelation more damaging than the last. Patricia admitted she'd been relieved when I was gone because I looked too much like Thomas's mother, who she'd always hated. Thomas confessed he'd seen me as a financial burden from the moment the Carlyle opportunity arose, just a line item that didn't fit the budget. My siblings watched their parents' marriage implode, with a mixture of horror and fascination. This was who their parents really were underneath the careful facade. This was the truth they'd built their family upon. Finally, Thomas asked again what it would take to make this go away. Not for him, he claimed, but for Kevin's medical career, for Sophie's brand, for Lisa's future. Using the other children as shields, just as he'd used them as excuses 20 years ago. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the ocean that should have been part of my childhood landscape. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere out there, other families were finishing their Thanksgiving dinners, truly grateful for each other. I want the truth, I said. Legal documents acknowledging what you did. The return of my inheritance with interest. A public statement taking responsibility, not hiding behind corporate policies or financial pressure. And I want you to know that forgiveness isn't mine to give. Margaret might have forgiven you from wherever she is now, but I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Lisa stood and came to stand beside me at the window. I'll help you, she said. Whatever you need. Legal testimony, public support, whatever. I've benefited from your abandonment my entire life without knowing it. The least I can do is stand with you now. Kevin joined us. I'm in too. I'll testify about the stolen inheritance, about the lies they told us. My medical career might take a hit, but my integrity is worth more than my reputation. Sophie was last, but her voice was strongest. I have 2 million followers who think they know my family. They're about to learn the truth. And Joyce, I'm going to make sure everyone knows you're my sister. My eldest sister who survived being thrown away and came back stronger than any of us. Patricia made one last desperate attempt. Please, we're still your parents. We made a terrible mistake, but we're still family. I turned to face them one final time. No, Margaret was my family. She chose me when you threw me away. She loved me when you found me unlovable. She sacrificed her freedom to raise your discarded child. She was everything parents should be, and you were nothing. Thomas, always the negotiator, pulled out his phone to call his attorney. Within an hour, he was transferring the money, signing affidavits, drafting the public statement. He moved with the efficiency of someone cutting losses, mitigating damage, protecting what assets remained. The documentation was swift and brutal. $2 million plus 20 years of compound interest came to nearly $8 million. Thomas had it barely, but it would mean selling the house, liquidating investments, dismantling the fortune built on my absence. As I prepared to leave to walk out of the house that had haunted my dreams for 2 decades, Lisa hugged me. It was awkward, tentative, but real. Kevin gave me his business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. Sophie already had her phone out typing my story for her followers. Patricia tried one more time as I reached the door. Joyce, please. Let me explain. Let me try to make this right. I looked at the woman who'd given birth to me, who'd sung me lullabies and kissed skinned knees, who'd held me tight and then let me go for a paycheck. You had 20 years to make it right. You chose not to every single day. Thomas said nothing already on his phone with damage control trying to save something from the wreckage. He'd written me off 20 years ago and I was still just a loss. To be managed, a problem, to be solved, a transaction to be completed. The aftermath of that Thanksgiving confrontation rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Sophie's post about discovering her abandoned sister went viral within hours. 2 million followers became 10 million as the story spread across platforms. The headline wrote itself, "Influencer discovers parents' abandoned sibling for corporate benefits." News outlets picked up the story within days. Investigative journalists dug into Carlyle Corporation's family policies, discovering a pattern of discrimination against larger families that sparked a federal investigation. Thomas was fired before he could resign his name, becoming synonymous with corporate greed and parental betrayal. Patricia's charity dissolved almost overnight as donors withdrew support. No one wanted to support a woman who'd abandoned her own child while claiming to help families in need. The irony was too bitter, the hypocrisy too blatant. She retreated into the house they'd soon have to sell, refusing interviews, deleting her social media presence. But the real story, the one that mattered, happened in the quieter moments away from the media frenzy. Kevin called me a week after Thanksgiving, asking if we could meet for coffee. We sat in a small cafe in Manhattan, two strangers trying to bridge 20 years of separation. He told me about medical school, how he'd always felt pressure to be perfect, to justify the opportunities our parents had given him. Now he understood those opportunities had been bought with my exile. He was struggling with whether to continue his residency, knowing his education had been funded by stolen money. I told him Margaret would want him to be a doctor, to use his skills to help children who needed it. She'd always believed in redemption through service. He cried then, this accomplished doctor mourning the sister he'd lost and the aunt he'd never known. Sophie flew to New York the following month, wanting to learn who I really was, beyond the viral story. We spent a weekend walking through the city talking about everything and nothing. She showed me videos from childhood birthdays, and I pointed out the tells that something was missing. The way Patricia's smile never quite reached her eyes, the way Thomas always seemed to be looking past the camera as if searching for something. She asked me to help her rebuild her platform with truth instead of facade. Together, we created content about family trauma, about choosing honesty over image, about the difference between blood relations and real family. Her followers responded with their own stories of abandonment and betrayal. We'd touched something universal in human pain. Lisa struggled the most with the revelation. She'd lived her entire life as the baby of the family, cherished and protected. Learning she'd been the catalyst for my abandonment, however unintentionally, sent her into a depression that required professional help. She took a leave from Stanford and entered therapy, trying to reconcile her existence with my exile. I visited her at the treatment center, bringing photos of Margaret and me over the years. I showed her my Yale graduation, my first day at the firm, Margaret's proud face at every milestone. I wanted her to understand that my life hadn't stopped when they left me behind. I'd grown and thrived despite them, not because of them. She asked if I hated her, this girl who'd lived the life stolen from me. I told her the truth. I'd hated the idea of her for years, this replacement daughter who'd made me expendable. But meeting her, seeing her pain and confusion, I realized she was as much a victim of our parents' choices as I was. The legal proceedings moved forward with mechanical precision. The forensic evidence of Thomas's forgery was overwhelming. Faced with potential criminal charges, he agreed to every demand. The $8 million was transferred to a trust I established in Margaret's name for abandoned and displaced children. The Margaret Chen Foundation launched 6 months after that Thanksgiving, providing legal support, therapeutic resources, and educational scholarships for children whose families had failed them. The first scholarship recipient was a 17-year-old girl whose parents had kicked her out for being gay. She reminded me of myself at that age, determined to build something from nothing. Thomas and Patricia's divorce was finalized within a year. She got the house in the settlement, but had to sell it anyway to cover legal fees and debts. She moved to a small apartment in Arizona, calling occasionally to leave voicemails I never returned. Her messages were always the same: apologies without accountability, regret without real understanding. Thomas relocated to a different state, taking a position with a small firm that either didn't know or didn't care about his history. He sent a letter once loyally and precise, outlining all the reasons his choices had been logical at the time. Even in writing, even after losing everything, he couldn't just say he was sorry he'd thrown away his daughter. But my siblings, these strangers who shared my DNA, slowly became family in the way Margaret had taught me family could be chosen intentional, worked for, rather than assumed. Kevin finished his residency and specialized in pediatric surgery for underserved communities. He said every child he saved was a small redemption for the sister he'd forgotten. He married Jennifer in a small ceremony, insisting I stand as part of the wedding party. His speech mentioned having 2 sisters, making sure everyone knew I existed, that I mattered. Sophie transformed her platform into something meaningful, using her influence to highlight stories of family trauma and healing. She featured the Margaret Chen Foundation, regularly helping us raise millions for abandoned children. Her followers called us the Sisters Separated, and our story became a catalyst for conversations about what family really means. Lisa and I developed the strongest bond, perhaps because she needed a big sister, and I'd always wanted to be one. She changed her major to social work, determined to protect children the way no one had protected me. She spent summers working at the foundation, learning how systemic failures enabled family abandonment. On the 2nd anniversary of Margaret's death, we all gathered at her grave. Kevin, Sophie, Lisa, and I stood together, a family forged from the ashes of another family's destruction. I told Margaret about the foundation, about the 150 children we'd helped so far, about the siblings who'd chosen me even after learning the truth. Lisa placed flowers, white roses, because she'd learned they were Margaret's favourite. Sophie read a poem about chosen mothers and found families. Kevin spoke about the oath doctors take to do no harm and how Margaret had embodied that principle in raising me. I stood there among my siblings, these people who'd been strangers 2 years ago, and felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years, wholeness. Not because our parents had finally acknowledged what they'd done, but because I'd built something better from the wreckage they'd created. The gravestone read, Margaret Chen, beloved aunt and mother, with the dates of her life. But those dates didn't capture what she'd been, the woman who'd caught a child thrown away, who'd given up her own dreams to repair someone else's nightmare, who'd loved without condition or reservation. 6 months later, I got married to Michael Morrison, a fellow attorney I'd met through the foundation. The wedding was small but perfect. Held in the garden where Margaret had taught me to grow things from seeds. Kevin walked me down the aisle, Sophie was my maid of honour, and Lisa did a reading about the families we choose. My parents weren't invited. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. Some choices once made can't be unmade. They'd chosen their path 20 years ago, and I'd chosen mine. During the reception, Michael's father gave a toast about gaining a daughter. His words were simple but sincere, welcoming me to their family with open arms. His mother hugged me and whispered that Margaret would be so proud. They'd never met her, but they knew her through me, through the person she'd helped me become. Our first dance was to a song Margaret used to hum while cooking dinner, an old tune about finding your way home. As Michael held me, I realized I'd finally found what I'd been looking for all those years. Not the family that had left me, but the family that had chosen me, fought for me, refused to let me disappear. 6 months after the wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. The ultrasound showed twins, and the irony wasn't lost on me. The girl who'd been discarded for being one child too many was having 2 at once. Kevin joked that it was cosmic justice. Sophie immediately started planning the most elaborate baby shower in history. Lisa began knitting tiny hats, despite having no idea how to knit. They rallied around me the way siblings should present, and excited and slightly overbearing in their enthusiasm. When my son and daughter were born on a snowy December morning, I named them Margaret and James, after the woman who'd saved me and Michael's grandfather who'd raised him. They entered a world surrounded by chosen family aunts and uncles, who'd fought to know them grandparents, who'd welcomed their mother without reservation, and parents who could never leave them behind. Patricia sent a card when the twins were born, asking if she could meet her grandchildren. I sent it back unopened. Some doors once closed should stay that way. Thomas made no attempt at contact, his silence more honest than any words could have been. The Margaret Chen Foundation grew beyond what I'd imagined, helping thousands of abandoned children find justice, therapy, and hope. Every success story was a small victory against the pain of being thrown away. Every reunited family that chose to do the work was proof that love could be stronger than abandonment. But more than the foundation, more than the money recovered or the justice served, the real triumph was simpler: I'd survived. More than survived, I'd thrived. I'd taken the worst thing that could happen to a child and transformed it into purpose. The 8-year-old girl standing in Margaret's driveway watching her family drive away couldn't have imagined this life. She couldn't have known that being thrown away would lead to being truly found. She couldn't have understood that some families are born from loss, not blood. As I write this, my twins are taking their first steps in the living room of the house Michael and I bought in Westchester, not far from where Margaret raised me. Kevin and his wife are expecting their first child. Sophie just got engaged to a wonderful woman who understands that family is complicated. Lisa graduated with honors and joined the foundation full-time. We gather for holidays now, this patchwork family built from broken pieces. We tell stories about Margaret, about resilience, about choosing each other. The twins will grow up knowing their history, all of it, the beautiful and the ugly, the abandonment and the choosing. Thomas still practices law somewhere in the Midwest. Patricia lives alone in Arizona. They got the life they chose, small and carefully controlled, with exactly the number of children that fit their parameters. I hope it was worth it. I hope the money kept them warm during all those nights they could have had their daughter. But I don't think about them often anymore. The space they left in my life has been filled with people who chose to stay. The wound they created has become a source of strength. The child they threw away became someone who catches other falling children. That's the thing about being abandoned. You can let it destroy you, or you can let it forge you into someone unbreakable. Margaret knew that. She'd been abandoned too in her own way by a sister who chose comfort over conscience. But she'd transformed that betrayal into fierce love for the niece left behind. The Margaret Chen Foundation's mission statement reads, "Every child deserves to be chosen. But the unwritten motto, the one we live by, is simpler. No child left behind. It's a promise, a vow, a sacred commitment to the children whose families failed them. I was never not good enough." That's what I understand now, what 20 years of distance and therapy and Margaret's love taught me. I was never the problem. They were never good enough for me, these people who could measure a child's worth in dollars and benefits. The truth came out, just as it always does. It came out in legal documents and viral posts and family confrontations and public shame. But more importantly, it came out in the life I built despite them, in the siblings who chose me, in the twins who will never doubt they're wanted. Margaret used to say that flowers grow through concrete if they want sunlight badly enough. She was talking about me, about children like me, about the stubborn refusal to let abandonment be the end of the story. She was right. We do grow through concrete, through abandonment, through the cracks others leave in our foundation. And when we bloom, we're beautiful in ways that protected flowers could never be. We're strong in ways that chosen children don't need to be. We're grateful for love in ways that those who've never lost it can't understand. This is my story, but it's not unique. There are millions of us, the abandoned ones, the thrown away children, the ones who didn't fit the picture. We're out here building lives from scratch, creating families from strangers choosing ourselves when no one else would. To those still in the darkness of fresh abandonment, still standing in driveways, watching tail lights disappear, still trying to understand what made you unworthy of keeping, you are enough. You were always enough. You will always be enough. The people who left you were the ones who weren't enough, not brave enough to fight for you, not strong enough to choose you, not good enough to deserve you. Your story isn't over when they drive away. That's just the beginning of becoming who you're meant to be, unencumbered by people too small to see your worth. Find your Margaret, the person who sees you're worth saving. Become someone else's Margaret when you're strong enough. Build the family you deserve, instead of mourning the one that failed you. And remember, being chosen by someone who could walk away but doesn't is infinitely more powerful than being kept by someone who sees you as an obligation. I was signed away, given up, abandoned. But I was also chosen, fought for, loved fiercely by a woman who owed me nothing but gave me everything. That's the duality of abandonment, the leaving and the finding, the breaking and the healing, the loss and the unexpected gain. My parents thought they were signing away a burden. They actually signed away their chance to know an extraordinary daughter. Their loss became Margaret's gain, and Margaret's love became my foundation. So thank you, Thomas and Patricia, for showing me early that DNA doesn't make a family. Thank you for the abandonment that led me to Margaret. Thank you for teaching me to choose my own family instead of accepting whatever I was born into. Your signature on those papers 20 years ago wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a better one where I got to choose who deserved my love, instead of begging for scraps of affection from people incapable of giving it. I hope the money was worth it. I hope the perfect family photos were worth it. I hope the corporate benefits and the comfortable life were worth it. Because you paid for them with your daughter, and that price was far too high. But I'm grateful now in a way I never thought I'd be. Grateful you showed me early that I deserved better. Grateful you cleared the path for Margaret to love me. Grateful you taught me that walking away from toxic people, even parents, is sometimes the greatest act of self-love. The 8-year-old girl you drove away from deserved parents who would fight for her. She got something better, an aunt who chose her siblings, who sought her out, and a future she built with her own hands. That little girl is gone now, replaced by a woman who knows her worth isn't determined by who leaves, but by who stays, not by who gave her life, but by who made that life worth living. Thank you for watching this story of abandonment transformed into triumph. If you've experienced family betrayal or abandonment, please share your story in the comments below. Let's build a community of chosen families of survivors who became thrivers. Please like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and redemption, and share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone in their abandonment. Remember, you are never not good enough. They were never good enough for you. Until next time, choose yourself, choose your family, and never apologize for surviving.